Welcome back to another episode of Mormon Traditionalist Podcast. My name is Jaron O'Driscoll, and I am your host. And today I have a really great interview to play for you guys with Jonathan Neville. Jonathan is an attorney by trade and has dedicated a great deal of his life to studying the translation of the gold plates and all the events surrounding it. And if you have ever wondered what happened to the gold plates after Joseph was done translating them, then this is an episode you won't want to miss. Before we get started, don't forget to take 2 minutes to leave a rating and review wherever you are listening. That will help a great deal to getting this podcast out to other traditionalists. Now, without further ado, let's get into my discussion with Jonathan. All right, Jonathan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking.
Oh, great. I've been looking forward to this. We've just had some technical difficulties getting all this set up and put together. But I've been really excited about this. We tried to get together. We've been emailing and tried to get together at the Firm Foundation Expo. That turned out to be really crazy, hectic for everybody. But I've been really looking forward to getting you in front of the mic and doing this. Can you give us real quick, give the audience a little bit of who you are, what your background is, how you got started in your work involving the gold plates and the events surrounding the translation and all that?
Sure. Well, just by way of background, my career as a lawyer, and I've also taught at a few colleges and things, but I've written a lot of books, and I got into this whole topic, actually by someone introduced me to Rod Meldrum, and I had been working on a novel involving Native Americans, and I asked him a little bit about the connection between Native Americans and the Book of Mormon. And that led to a discussion. I ended up going on a tour with him. He opened my eyes to this whole different understanding of the Book of Mormon that I had been unaware of before, and it made a lot more sense to me than what I had been taught previously, which was all centered in Mesoamerica. And so I inquired into why we ever got started in Mesoamerica, and I had about 30 pages of notes, and it turned into the first book that I did. And that was, I don't know, 6 years ago, something like that.
Is that the Mesomania book?
No, that was the one called Lost City of Zarahemla. Actually, It was the first one. And then a series, that one generated more questions. And everything that I've done since has just been answering questions that I've had.
Okay, yeah, I was watching some of the old Living Scriptures animated series with my boys the other day. And in the Mormon and Moroni episode, it shows Moroni putting the gold plates in the Urim and Thummim in the stone box, right? Along with the Liahona and the Sword of Laban. And that's kind of the narrative that we grew up with, right? Like Moroni was setting Joseph up to open his own Nephite history museum or something.
Right.
The details surrounding the physical plates and the translation is greatly misunderstood, I think. So can you start by helping us clear up what exactly was left by Moroni in that stone box and why?
That's a good place to start, because when the original accounts that Joseph and Oliver gave was that there was the plates, the abridged plates, the Urim and Thummim, or the spectacles they call them, and the breastplate, and that was it. Those are the only three things in the box. And then later on, starting around 100 years ago, I guess, when this idea of two Comoras came up, that there was one Comora down in Mexico and one in North America, the historians started to say, well, because the three witnesses saw the Liahona and the Sword of Laban, that must have also been in the stone box. And so that was just created out of whole cloth. There's a complete invention of the historians and the Mesoamerican advocates.
Purely cultural myth.
Yeah, purely. And there's no historical basis for it other than to justify their theory about Mesoamerica. And so that's led to a lot of confusion. Even if you go to the visitor centers, they show this Sword of Laban somehow crammed into this relatively small stone box. And, and it's frustrating because Oliver Cowdery explained it in a lot of detail in what he wrote, a series of 8 essays about church history, the first real church history. And in essay number 8, he described that stone box in a lot of detail, the stone pillars, how it was constructed with cement, and so on. And of course, neither he nor Joseph ever claimed that the Sword of Laban was in there, or the Liahona. And I guess the reason that got confused is they did talk about those objects being in the repository of records. It's talked about in Mormon 6:6.
So let's back up a little bit here.
Okay.
You said the abridged records. What do you mean by the abridged records? And how many sets of plates were there? What's the difference between the large and small plates of Nephi? We hear that a lot growing up, but what is the physical difference? And what do you mean by the abridged plates?
Okay, there's really kind of three concepts here to discuss. The thing to go by is the title page of the Book of Mormon, which Joseph Smith said was on the last leaf of the plates that he got from the stone box. And that is like a table of contents. And it says the record consisted of an abridged record of the Nephites, which was the part that Mormon abridged. And then there was the record of the Jaredites, which Moroni abridged. And then Moroni said he sealed it, meaning he sealed the whole record together, but he also added his little record at the very end, the Book of Moroni. And that was it. That's the only thing that was discussed or listed in the table of contents. So that's what I call the abridged plates. That would have included the Book of Lehi that Joseph originally translated. That was 116 pages that were lost. So that's all that was in the stone box. When Joseph took those down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, he translated that entire set except for the sealed portion that Moroni had mentioned. There was a portion that was sealed that he was not to translate. When they got near the end, he and Oliver were working on it, and they asked the Lord, or at least they deliberated among themselves, thinking that they would go back and retranslate the Book of Lehi that had been lost, 116 pages. And that's what led to D&C 10 that we have today, where the Lord tells them, no, don't retranslate that stuff. Instead, you're going to have to translate the plates of Nephi. And what we hadn't realized until the last couple of years is they didn't have the plates of Nephi. This gets back to your question of what were the small plates, the large plates. The small plates of Nephi were the ones that he talked about where he recorded in his own handwriting, so to speak, or his own record keeping, the history of his people from a sacred standpoint. And the large plates were the records of the kings and the wars and so on. So Mormon abridged the large plates, and that's how we have those ended up in the stone box. Well, when the Lord told Joseph he had to translate the plates of Nephi, he was referring to these small plates. And so but they didn't have those at that point in Harmony. So before Joseph left Harmony, he gave the plates, the abridged plates, to a divine messenger, he said, who took them back to Cumorah. And then apparently, from all we can tell from the historical sequence of events, the messenger found the small plates of Nephi in the hill Cumorah and took those to Fayette. And that's why Joseph translated the small plates in Fayette. So that's hard to understand without a graphic to explain it all. Right. But the easy way to do it is the small plates of Nephi in the Book of Mormon today go from First Nephi through Words of Mormon. That's the small plates. Those were not abridged. Those were not in the stone box that Moroni created, but they were in the repository that was in the same hill. And Orson Pratt explained there are two different compartments in the hill. There was the stone box that Moroni had built to hold the abridged plates for Joseph to find, and a separate part of the hill was the repository of all the plates that Mormon had brought over from the hill Shem. He describes that in Mormon 6:6. And Oliver Cowdery told David Whitmer, as well as Brigham Young and others, about how he and Joseph had visited this repository and seen all the records and the sword of Laban and all that stuff.
And that's where we get all of those, the cultural myths. That's where we get, they had seen some of those artifacts and some of those things. They just weren't in that stone box, but that's where we're getting that from.
That's right. They were, because when they went in there, in fact, they even said one time this sword of Laban was sheathed and another time it was unsheathed. So, and they described piles of plates, and there's a table, and there's a stone shelf, all these specifics that they've described in this room. Well, it's mainly Oliver Cowdery who described it. And so that particular explanation from Oliver Cowdery wasn't that well known in the early days of the church, although Wilford Woodruff talked about it, Heber C. Kimball, and several others talked about it. But Brigham Young really was concerned towards the end of his life that it was going to be forgotten, that members of the church wouldn't know about it. And so I think it was about 2 months before he died, he gave a sermon, as I recall, it was in Farmington, where he explained what Oliver Cowdery told him about this repository of the records in the Hill Cumorah. Okay. And he specifically did it. So he said, I'm afraid people are going to forget about this if I don't tell you now. And he died 2 months later. So if he hadn't done that.
Good timing.
Yeah, it was. I mean, he was doing lots of things that last year of his life, but this was one of his most important things. As I recall, it was his next to last sermon that he ever gave. That's how important it was to him.
So going back to the beginning, originally in the stone box, we have the Urim and Thummim, which is the spectacles and the breastplate.
Right.
And the set of plates in the stone box.
The abridged plates, yeah.
The abridged plates. The Book of the Book of Lehi was that 116 pages, correct? Yeah. And we know he lost those through Martin Harris. Mm-hmm. And so had that not happened, would we have ever known about the repository?
That's a good question. I don't know if we would have known about it or not. I think Joseph certainly had the idea that it was there after they met the messenger. And this is, I guess, backtrack a little bit, have a little bit of a flashback. When Joseph and Oliver left Harmony, David Whitmer had come down from Fayette to pick them up. And on their way back to Fayette in the wagon, they passed the guy on the road, and David offered to give him a ride to Fayette, assuming the guy was going to Fayette. And instead, the guy said, no, I'm going to Cumorah. And David remembered that it was the first time he'd ever heard the word Cumorah. He remembered that the rest of his life. And he asked Joseph about it, and Joseph Smith said it was one of the Nephites, and he had the plates, which makes sense because Joseph had given this messenger the plates before he left Harmony.
And this was the original abridged set of plates.
Right. And so this messenger was taking him over to Cumorah, presumably to leave the abridged records in the Hill Cumorah and get the plates of Nephi to take to Fayette in accordance with Doctrine and Covenants section 10. And it's interesting here too, because in Joseph Smith's history in the Pearl of Great Price, it says that when he was finished with the plates, he gave them by prior arrangement to a messenger, divine messenger. But Brigham Young said when he finished with the plates, he took them back to the Hill Cumorah. So those are conflicting stories until you understand that they're talking about two different sets of plates. Joseph was talking about the original abridged plates he gave to the messenger. The small plates, or the plates of Nephi that he translated as First Nephi through Words of Mormon, he did take back to the Hill Cumorah, to the repository, as Brigham Young said.
And that clears up the issue that some people have where there are multiple accounts of the size of the plates, correct? There are different accounts that have different sizes and dimensions for the plates.
Yeah, several people said that the plates weighed around 60 pounds, but Joseph's father said he weighed them and they weighed 30 pounds. And so the farmers know what things weighed because they would sell their grain and everything by weight. And so that's a major discrepancy that is explained if they were talking about two different sets of plates. And we would assume that the plates of Nephi would have been smaller anyway than the abridged plates in terms of depth and weight. Another interesting aspect of that is the 8 witnesses never said anything about a sealed portion, but it says they handled the pages. So if anyone was going to talk about a sealed portion, it would have been the 8 witnesses, and they never did. And that's because they saw the plates of Nephi.
So which books are we talking about here in the pages, in the 116 pages? And when Joseph translated the small plates, what did we get in return? What was the exchange there?
Okay, that's a good question. The first book, as far as we know, the first book in the abridged plates was the Book of Lehi. And that's what Joseph initially translated, mostly with Martin Harris. So Martin Harris lost 116 pages, which was mostly the Book of Lehi. Apparently has probably included most of the first 2 chapters of the Book of Mosiah that we have today, because the Book of Mosiah we have today, even though it says Mosiah 1, was originally Mosiah 3. And so that the abridged plates that we have today started with the Book of Mosiah through Moroni. The plates of Nephi that Joseph translated up in Fayette were the plates or the record of First Nephi through Words of Mormon. And then we don't have time to get into the details, but some of the Words of Mormon appear to have been part of the lost part of the Book of Mosiah that Joseph made as a bridge. When he lost 116 pages, he retained a small portion of what he had translated. And that appears to be the last few verses of the Words of Mormon.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I know from talking to David Hawking, he said, I had never known that 116 pages involved the first couple of chapters of Mosiah. That was news to me. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So what in that whole transition, that whole switch, is there anything that we got from getting the small plates that we would not necessarily have gotten with just the Book of Lehi?
It's pure speculation. What we got that was extra. The Lord said in D&C 10 that there was important things in there about his gospel that he wanted us to have. We don't know what part of those records from First Nephi through Words of Mormon were not included in the Book of Lehi, but apparently some of it was not included. We just don't know what. So, for example, we assume that the Book of Lehi told more of the series of kings and more what happened with their government and so on. I know there's a book out called The Lost 116 Pages by Don Bradley, and he talks about some of what he suspects is some of the content that would have been in the Book of Lehi. For example, in Nauvoo, one time Joseph Smith said that he talked about the places of burial being sacred to the people, as it talks about in the Book of Mormon. But it doesn't say anything like that in the Book of Mormon we have today. So apparently that was an allusion to the Book of Lehi that we didn't have.
Interesting.
Or that we don't have now. And there's a few other details that early members of the church who would have had access to the Book of Lehi or had heard Joseph talk about it related.
And on the other flip side of that, is there anything that was left out of the Book of Lehi that we know, or even if it's speculation, I obviously understand that. Is there anything in the Book of Lehi that it had that maybe we didn't get in the small plates, or do we get everything that we needed to get?
We all we could do is speculate. Like I say, Joseph alluded to this discussion of the burial grounds being sacred, which is not in our Book of Mormon today. And so I know one person said that he had heard someone read the 116 pages. And this is a long story, but it was Lucy Harris who had loaned them out, and someone purported or claimed that he had a copy of them, and he was reading them to people. And someone who heard him read them said it talked about the mounds and the burial places.
Oh, interesting.
Which, yeah, it is interesting because that is a further link to the North American setting, of course. But we don't have the actual pages to verify that, but that's just what he related.
Right. Well, going in on that same vein, moving away from speculation and going back to the North American model, the Hill Cumorah. Tell me about the significance first off of the Hill Cumorah in Book of Mormon times. A lot of this is probably rudimentary, elementary stuff, but for people that don't understand, what is the significance of both in Book of Mormon times of the Hill Cumorah and also in Joseph Smith's time? Okay,
well, of course, the Hill Cumorah was called the Hill Ramah by the Jaredites, the older civilization. So it was the same hill. And in Nephite times, it was called Cumorah. And according to Joseph's mother, when the very first night that Moroni visited Joseph Smith in 1823, he told him about this record of the ancient inhabitants of the country. And he said it had been concealed or buried in a hill not far from his house, and he named the hill as Cumorah. It's about 3 miles from Joseph's home. And Moroni told him it had been written and deposited not far from his house. So Joseph learned the very first night that he met Moroni that the name of the hill where the record was deposited was Cumorah. He learned that directly from Moroni. And then later in 1827, early 1827, before he got the plates, he went to Manchester to do a chore, to do some work. And on his way back, he walked by the hill Cumorah, and Moroni was there and chastised him for not being as diligent as he should have been. And he told him that now is the time to get ready to receive the plates, which he did later that year in September. When he came home and reported that to his parents, he told them that as he was passing by the hill of Cumorah, and that's because everybody in his family knew that was the hill Cumorah, since Moroni had told them that the very first night. So the name Cumorah was, Joseph knew that name, and his family knew that name before they knew any of the other proper nouns in the Book of Mormon. In fact, as far as we know, it's the only name that they knew, because his mother referred to the visitor as an angel, not by name Moroni, but she did refer to the name of the hill as Cumorah. So why this is significant is it's the hill Cumorah plays a central role at the conclusion of the Book of Mormon, because that's where the battles of extermination took place. And in Mormon's own book, Mormon chapter 6, verse 6, he says that in this hill Cumorah, he buried deposited all the records of the Nephites that he had used to abridge his own record. In other words, he had these piles of plates over 1,000 years of history that he concealed in the hill Cumorah, and then he gave the plates that were the abridgment to his son Moroni. And this is interesting too, because people ask, well, why would Mormon have chosen the hill Cumorah as a final, the last stand of his people? Because it's a hill among many in western New York. It's not particularly strategic. Why would he have chosen that hill? And when you understand the history of the Book of Mormon, it's an easy answer. And that's because he knew the Jaredites had been at that same hill. And they had built a fortress, so to speak, let's say. They had fortified the hill. And so he would know that his last chance, his best chance of preserving his people would be to go somewhere where there's already a fort prepared. Apparently with subterranean networks, or at least rooms that he could hide the records in, as well as maybe some of his people, and have a headquarters. And so that's why he went to the hill Cumorah. Now, related to that, it's interesting that Heber C. Kimball, after he joined the church in 1832, in his journal, he said he went to the hill Cumorah. He wanted to see it for himself. And he said he could still see the embankments around the hill. So he knew it was a fortification even as late as 1832. Since then, it's all been farmed and plowed, and there's one little residue of the embankment you can see on a detailed topographical map, but the rest of it's been plowed under.
Interesting. So the hill Cumorah, like this, it makes perfect sense. The whole Heartland model makes perfect sense. It's completely, it's an easy logical thing to understand. Why do we have this opposing narrative, this two Cumorah narrative, and what assumptions and leaps and bounds have to be made to make that work?
That's a long question, but here, I'll just give you
Reader's Digest.
Yeah, I'll give you the historical development of it. Okay, for Joseph and Oliver, the hill Cumorah was just an established fact. In fact, Oliver wrote these series of historical essays I mentioned, First Church History. In essay number 7, published as letter 7, which you can look up in the Joseph Smith papers. In fact, all you have to do is go to the Joseph Smith papers, on their search, type in letter and then VII, the Roman numeral, letter 7, and it'll take you right to this letter. You can see it for yourself. But in there, he was describing the facts of the Book of Mormon to show that it was an actual history, a literal history. And one of those facts was that the final battles described in Mormon chapter 6 took place in the mile-wide valley west of the hill Cumorah there right in New York. So Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, all of his contemporaries, and all of his successors so far have reaffirmed that situation where the Hill Cumorah is in New York. What happened, though, is over time, people started speculating about where the rest of the sites in the Book of Mormon were. Where was Zarahemla? Where was Lamb Bountiful? Where was Sidon? All these other sites. And so some people speculated that Lehi landed in Chile, and South America was the land of the Nephites. North America was land of the South America is the land of the Lamanites. North America was the land of the Nephites, and so on. So there's a lot of speculation floating around. And in 1840, I think it was, Orson Pratt wrote a pamphlet about the restoration of the church. And in there, he spent about 3 or 4 pages talking about the inhabitants of Central and South America as being the descendants of Lehi. When Joseph Smith wrote the Wentworth letter, he used Orson Pratt's pamphlet as a model. He basically edited it and used it for the Wentworth letter. When he got to Orson Pratt's speculation about who the Lamanites were, Joseph crossed all that out and said, the remnant are the Indians that live in this country. And he was in Illinois at the time because he knew who the Lamanites were. And they were the people living in this country, i.e. the United States and the Midwest, where they had been removed from the northeastern United States. So it's crystal clear who the Lamanites were. Hill Cumorah was in New York. But at the same time in Nauvoo in 1842, this was later that year when he wrote the Wentworth letter, there was some speculative articles about the ruins in Central America being left by the Nephites. And in retrospect, they were preposterous speculation because archaeologists know that those ruins they were talking about far post-dated Book of Mormon times. They could not have been left by the Nephites. But at the time, the people didn't know that. And so they started thinking that Central America had to be where the Nephites were. And it wasn't until around 1917, I think it was, there was a scholar from the Reorganized Church, RLDS, named L.E. Hills, who came up with this idea of 2 Cumorahs. And he said, okay, we all know there's a Cumorah in New York, but for the geography to fit, it had to be in a small area in Central America. So the real Hill Cumorah, where the battles took place, must have been down there. Oliver Cowdery was wrong. He was speculating. Joseph Smith didn't know what he was talking about. We figured it out that it's down in Central America. And so he created this map that is essentially the same one the Mesoamerican scholars talk about today, where he showed all the events of the Book of Mormon ranging from southern Mexico down to roughly Guatemala, with the Hill Cumorah down that location. And ever since then, they've been fixated on Central America. And it's really inexplicable to me why they do that, because there's nothing about the Mayan culture that you see in the Book of Mormon. And what the Book of Mormon describes is a relatively small population living along the rivers, because they built ships and they lived along rivers. They had earthworks. They created mounds. They had pickets of wood along their walls.
That's something that really fascinates me, is the wood thing. I remember watching that again with my boys the other day on the episode from the Living Scriptures, the animated series where Christ returns, and all the death and destruction's coming, and lightning is striking these stone buildings that all of a sudden catch flame, and it's funny to me. We could do a whole nother episode on all the evidence for the Book of Mormon, all that kind of stuff, but that's really interesting. So that narrative initially started with the RLDS Church, now the Community of Christ. And,
well, actually, this L.E. Hills was a member of their church, but he submitted his map and his ideas to their first presidency, which was Joseph Smith III. It was Joseph Smith's son and his counselors, and they rejected it. They said, no, we don't buy off on this. Yeah. So L.E. Hills was kind of on his own. And at the same time, Joseph Fielding Smith rejected it. He said, well, you can't say Cumorah's down there. We all know it's in New York. And he said this idea of two Comoras is going to cause people to be confused and disturbed in their faith in the Book of Mormon. But he was only an apostle and the church historian, later became president of the church, but he didn't have a PhD in archaeology. And so our modern scholars discount everything he said. We're talking about Joseph Fielding Smith.
Right.
And they say, well, we have PhDs in archaeology. We can find all these correspondences between how we read the Book of Mormon and what we find in Central America. And they just are constantly confirming their own biases down there. Those who have actually visited Central America and know a little bit about the Mayan culture can see it's an entirely different culture. It had nothing to do with Christian or Hebrew influence. And so it's just a perplexing thing. And I don't have a good answer for why they still teach it.
I think all the habits die hard is among many reasons, but I think it's, once you've got your own narrative, it's hard to let go. Nobody likes to be wrong, right?
Yeah, I think that, and I think part of it is that they can't bear the idea that they've taught thousands of faithful Latter-day Saint students things that aren't true. I think they just don't want to face up to that.
That's a lot of responsibility to bear.
It is, and I really like those guys. I know many of them pretty well, and some of them not as well, but they're all wonderful scholars and faithful church members. But they keep pushing this Mesoamerican narrative that just doesn't make sense. And worse, it contradicts what the prophets have taught.
That's all for this week, folks. Next week, we get into more fascinating details surrounding the plates, the repository, and its contents, as well as the big question, what happened to the gold plates? Remember, you can send your questions, comments, and hate mail to mormontraditionalist@gmail.com, and follow me on Instagram @mormontraditionalist for additional content. And until next time, remember, never back down from the truth.